The U.S. Secretary of Defense issues a warning over what he calls the growing threat of a cyber war. Leon Panetta says the U.S. government will do whatever it takes to defend itself against any online attacks. But how serious is the threat? And what would a cyber war mean for the U.S. and the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Well, he called it a cyber Pearl Harbor. That's what Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, says the United States is facing. He's warning that the US is vulnerable and that it's only a matter of time before power grids, transport systems or financial networks are attacked.
The most destructive scenarios involve cyber actors launching several attacks on our critical infrastructure at one time, in combination with a physical attack on our country. Attackers could also seek to disable or degrade critical military systems and communication networks. The collective result of these kinds of attacks could be a cyber Pearl Harbor.
Here's a look at some recent cyber attacks. Operation Shady Rat is a hacking campaign believed to have originated in China. Over the last 6 years, it has targeted about 70 public and private sector organizations in 14 countries. Just last year, the Stuxnet worm targeted an Iranian nuclear facility. It is believed to be part of a US-Israeli operation against Iran called Operation Olympic Games. And in August, the world's largest oil company, Saudi Aramco, was hit by a virus called Shamoon that damaged 30,000 workstations. That was quickly followed by an attack on Qatar's Rasgas, one of the world's largest producers of natural gas. A so-called hacktivist group in the Middle East claimed responsibility. So how real is the threat of a cyber war? To talk more about this, we're joined by guests in Washington, D.C., Catherine Lotriante. She's a professor at Georgetown University. In London, Rob Densmore, a defence journalist who's a former US Navy airman. Also in London, Jason Moon, a white hat hacker. Let's start off with you, Catherine. What do you think constitutes a cyber Pearl Harbor?
So I think what Secretary Panetta was referring to was the real concern by a number of nation states of the potential for the cyber domain, like the other domains of air, land, and sea, to be used not only for international and foreign relations, but also a platform for conflict, for armed hostilities. And he pointed out the potential to use this forum of cyberspace at a time when conventional arms would be used as well. So there's this concern that our critical infrastructures, like other states' critical infrastructures, are vulnerable to cyber attacks, which could complicate any state's ability to act in self-defense from such an attack.
Are you seeing differences of opinion in different administrations?
In terms of the threat, I don't think so. Based on, it is clear that we understand what the vulnerabilities are. Still seeking to resolve the vulnerabilities. I don't think between administrations, Republicans or Democrats in the U.S. would maybe disagree. I think there may be disagreement as to how to respond. One, how to resolve the vulnerabilities in our own systems, but also if we did suffer an attack, it would be up to a particular White House to decide if and when and how the U.S. would respond.
Rob,
and there may be disagreement on that aspect.
What you've seen as a former US Navy airman, do you agree? Are we seeing a next Pearl Harbor?
Well, I think that we need to be clear that US military capabilities are advancing at a steady rate, and they have been for a couple of years now, in what we call interdicting the network. And this network, which was really once restrained to intercepting something as simple as radar and radar signals, now we're talking about using military assets to become heavily involved in the cyber domain. I think that we need to be really clear, too, about what Panetta is saying, and I think there's some subtext to what he's talking about. And the tone that he's using, the messages that he's using are quite different than what was said by the Pentagon in 2011, which was something on the order of, we'll send missiles down chimneys for cyber attacks against the U.S. In other words, we will retaliate with physical attacks if we are attacked through the cyber domain. We suddenly realized it was very difficult to define or even attribute any attack in the cyber domain. And so Panetta's recasting these kinds of attacks against the U.S., placing the U.S. as a potential victim. And this changes the dynamic completely for what motivates
You say he's placing the
taxpayers.
U.S. as a potential victim, but isn't it fair to say that the U.S. has conducted its own version of Pearl Harbor? Look at that attack on Iran, Stuxnet and the flame.
Yes, I mean, there's no denying that the U.S. has played a role in active cyber offensives. I think if you asked the designers of some of those programs what the mission objective was, it would have been a response to what NATO allies and what the UN has been pushing and has been pursuing diplomatic efforts to counteract, which are one of them being Iran's growing nuclear capability.
You were involved, you flew in Prowler jets. One of your missions was to jam radio systems. I mean, this is the US engaging in some type of cyber war, and for some time already.
This has been occurring. I mean, a lot of this is still very much in its formative stages, but we do have capability in this area now to interdict computer systems that are connected to a network. I think that the important thing to take away from what Panetta is talking about, though, is that those capabilities have existed, and the funding for that has existed. What we need to take a clear look at, though, is who Panetta is talking to. And I think he's sending a very clear message to the U.S. taxpayer and to the U.S. defense industry, which is rapidly looking at combat drawing down in Afghanistan, all U.S. forces to come out of Iraq pretty soon. And I think there's concern there about where our priorities are going to shift, where U.S. priorities are going to shift in terms of identifying the next big enemy in the world. And Panetta is saying that this is it.
Jason, I mean, this could be the next cash cow, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's what's going on here as well. I mean, they had some bills blocked where the government was trying to insist that corporations in America keep their security to a certain level, and that bill was blocked. Cybersecurity bill, and yeah, I mean, this is a new arms race. I think it is a cash cow. I think there has to be some questions asked as to whether you need to spend this amount of money on this kind of technology, on this kind of warfare, because at the end of the day, you're always going to be able to hack someone. Is there
Could it be
really
as
much point
simple
to
as
sort of
possibly just changing a password?
Yeah, I mean, I think they need to look at the fundamentals, the basics. If you look at the attacks which have happened against America thus far, they are always because of real negligent lapses in basic security, like no password, really things like that. So I think you need to get the fundamentals right before you start spending billions on this kind of thing. Absolutely, yeah.
Catherine, do you think that what Panetta was trying to do, another one of his subtexts, that he's actually preparing the country for more spending?
Well, one, I think it's very important that Secretary Panetta and other U.S. officials are speaking openly about the cyber threat and the concern. In fact, the U.S. government's been criticized for a long time that we haven't been as transparent with our public about what the concerns are. So it is very important that our government elected officials speak openly to the people about what we face in terms of a threat. Now, in terms of how much money one needs to spend to defend oneself in this domain is a question that I leave up to the experts, both the budgetary people as well as the defense and the operators. Now, one aspect I would strongly disagree with is that I would not say that the U.S. has conducted anything like the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor that Secretary Panetta was talking about. I would also say that I don't think he is changing anything from what the Pentagon and others have been saying since 2010, 2011, and the fact that if we are attacked through a cyber attack that would be equivalent to an armed attack under international law, or if we're attacked through conventional, we will, in the equivalent impact, so the equivalence test is the threshold, is that which would reach that threshold of an armed attack. He is still reserving the right, which is what he said in 2011, that's been referred to, that the U.S. will respond and will respond in accordance with international law and self-defense, and it may be in a kinetic means or it may be in a cyber means. But I think he has maintained that, and nothing has changed.
Okay, I'd like to talk more about the response a little later on. He does say, though, Panetta again, that the three potential adversaries out there that are developing the greatest capabilities are Russia, China, and Iran. I mean, Catherine, are we seeing Bush's type of equivalent of a cyber axis of evil?
No, I wouldn't call it an axis of evil, and in fact, evil has nothing to do with it. The motivations behind a state developing strong cyber capabilities are not about being evil or good, but the reality is these are the states that have, and the United States has quite a lot of cyber capability as well. But those states have been using their cyber capabilities in a negative way that would rise at times, what needs to be analyzed, whether it rises to the level in terms of a response, a use of force, or an armed attack, and particularly IP theft. You know, the intellectual property theft, the Office of the DNI, the counterintelligence executive came out with a report, an official report in 2010, and they called out China as well as other states stealing U.S. IP, which is very detrimental to the U.S. national security and our viability in future as an economic growth area.
Jason, you were shaking your head there. What is it that you're disagreeing with?
Yeah, well, she got to it at the end. I mean, a couple of points. Why is there this need to actually escalate this new domain, this new arms race? I mean, there's not really been any aggression militarily against us with it. Yes, there is IP theft. That's what it's used for. But we do exactly the same thing to them. They're very much pointing the finger at China and Russia. Are China or Russia really going to attack the US? I don't think so. Are they going to hack into corporations and look at their R&D data? Yes, absolutely. We do exactly the same thing to them.
Is that what you do, Jason? Are you a white hat hacker? Does that mean that you are one of the good guys?
Well, I would be employed by a company, an organisation, to protect that R&D data, to prevent China coming in and nicking up your research. That's where I would come in. So I very much work from that angle, and I have seen that a lot. It's quite rife, actually, within the industry.
So who poses the biggest threat here? Is it nation states or individuals?
It depends. If you're talking about an act of aggression that she was talking about just now, then it's not nation states so much. Well, certainly not Russia or China. You know, you need to look at terrorist attacks, things like that.
And Rob, I guess the worry here is that you don't have to be rich to be effective. All you need is a computer.
Well, that's correct. And I think the other misnomer is that you need some kind of army of hackers out there, all generating code and reading code. And it's a fallacy. I mean, I think that, you know, some of our best intelligence was telling us 12 months ago that the really most effective and dangerous hackers in China, we're talking about a handful of people, probably. And so, you know, I think the idea that, you know, you need armies out there doing this kind of mass concerted effort is a fallacy. I think also, too, we risk covering a lot of ground that's been debated off and on over the years about rules of engagement in terms of cyber warfare. And I mean, I should point out that NATO has been discussing over several years at their annual conference in Tallinn, Estonia, rules of engagement for cyber conflict and cyber war. And I should point out that basically is a violation of sovereignty that causes physical damage and or the use of force. So that's assuming that you can, as I said before, attribute that attack. And that is something that we found China, for example, to be extremely good at doing, is concealing where those attacks come from. So until we nail
I mean,
down
that
attribution,
must be incredibly hard, isn't it, to follow that footprint?
oh, it's incredibly hard. I mean, this is the first, and Jason's probably the first person to talk to on this. But I mean, I think that this is the level of effectiveness of hacking at the state level, is that you have that much more capital at your expense to cover your tracks and to go through the process of really creating an elaborate breach.
And I should imagine that's quite sophisticated at the moment, Jason, isn't it? Selling possibly soft and hardware that have already been fixed or tampered with.
Yeah, that's right. But I have to question whether some of this is slightly xenophobic. I mean, you have corporations in America, and you have even from the government level, sort of putting pressure on corporations to not give contracts to Chinese companies. So I wonder if that's sort of part of this whole mix, whether there's just a general feeling of just keeping China out of America and out of American corporations and out of American contracts.
Catherine, do you think that's what's happening here, that there's a certain level of xenophobia, certainly targeting China?
No, I think what's happening is that we know what's going on with respect to what China's doing. Our supply chain has been corrupted, and we know it is. But the reality is just about every computer in the United States purchased by any different company will have chips or some part that's been manufactured in China. So the reality is you will not be able to take care of that problem. I don't think it has anything to do with us vis-a-vis China. In fact, we do quite a lot of important work as a nation state to nation state with China. That is not going to end. But there are concerns based upon what we know China is doing as active cyber operations, both in the corporate espionage, which, by the way, the U.S. does not do corporate espionage. We do classic political espionage, and so do they. But it's
Jason
not about
was smiling
them.
there. Do you know anything to the contrary, Jason?
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I would say that part of the function, part of the remit of these intelligence agencies is to provide, in a sense, to assist American business. Put it like that.
Very diplomatic. Rob, what do you think the rules of engagement are at the moment? How have they changed of late?
Again, this is a very tough area because a lot of this is posturing, and so we have to pay very close attention at what is said at these high levels. I think the fact that Panetta is talking about this, I think that he's recasting the threat. And that threat that he's talking about is an offensive threat against the U.S. If I were to interpret that, I would say that we're trying to create a base of support among the American population, a sense of understanding that this is a threat not only to livelihood but to national welfare. And he mentioned critical infrastructure. So we're talking about power grids. We're talking about power to grids that control, for example, nuclear power stations, things like this. Now this is something that in the industry has been talked about for quite some time. We haven't yet seen that kind of risk or a breach in the U.S., to my knowledge, but for some reason now Panetta is bringing this up. So
Catherine, if we do see that kind of threat to the U.S., say, let's talk about parity here. How do you judge your response? Do you partake in cyber? Does the U.S. partake in cyber war? Does the U.S. bomb the country involved? How does it work?
Here, the rules that are applicable in this case, as in beyond cyber, would be international law. The United States has come out clearly and stated as a matter of policy, the White House did, that we are operating under the laws of armed conflict in cyberspace, just as we do in other domains. China has come out and indicated the opposite, which is what is disconcerting and what a lot of the U.S. officials are working on a diplomatic level with them. But the rules that are relevant would be the UN Charter, and the treaties related to the armed conflict itself. But if there is a use of force that rises to the level of an armed attack under Article 51 of the UN Charter, then the U.S. has always and will always maintain the right to use self-defense. And that's what Secretary Panetta is saying.
What is the chain of
it's
command here? I mean, excuse me interjecting. Would Obama, at the end of the day, make the final call? Is he brought in on everyday events or just the most threatening?
So it depends. As Commander-in-Chief, the President would have to authorize any activity that would involve U.S. Military engagement abroad. The President would also have to personally authorize any covert action done in self-defense by the CIA or any other aspect of the U.S. government. So, but on a day-to-day basis, if it's a military self-defense move, the Secretary of Defense would be in charge of the day-to-day operations. But clearly, whether it's an invasion of Iraq in 2003, whether it's the Gulf War in the early 90s, the U.S. President would have to make that call.
Jason, is it the same in the UK? Are we looking at the same way of operating?
Yeah, basically, yeah. I would just make one caveat. Yes, these actions have to be approved, but when you're talking about the intelligence services, sometimes the granular detail isn't really known about, and there is a certain level of carte blanche. Well, I think there's the attitude that they've got carte blanche, because if you look at history, I mean, there's always, they're always getting their wrists slapped if they sort of overstep that line. But so we have to be very careful. I mean, just generally, I would say you have to be very careful with escalating this domain. Is there really reason to do that? Do we really want to spend a lot of money in this domain? Do we really want to take actions which are going to facilitate a reaction? I'm dubious whether we really need to do that, and is that healthy for the world in general?
I know, Rob, that you also agree that this should be taken with a pinch of salt, Panetta's remarks, but how would you define cyber war at the moment? Is it in its nascent stage, and where do you think we'll be in, say, 10 years' time?
It's still very ephemeral. I think that all major actors would prefer it stay that way. I think to address previous comments, we need to be very clear. When we transition from detecting and even repulsing whatever we may call a cyber attack, moving from that to potentially deploying troops on the ground, which is what we're talking about here. This is part of the equation if we're responding with military action. This is going to have to be explained very clearly to the American public. We no longer live in the days of pre-Gulf War I, when we can sell wars based on the shortness of an air campaign and guaranteeing the loss of a few American lives. It just doesn't work that way anymore, and the American public is savvy. And I think that the President, the administration, and the Pentagon needs to be very clear about how they explain their reasoning in moving from escalation to escalation to escalation.
Well, thanks very much to my guests in Washington, D.C., Catherine Lotriante in London, Rob Densmore. Also in London, Jason Moon, and thank you very much for joining us. This edition of Inside Story. If you would like to send us your feedback, please email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.